Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 51 of the podcast. So, a few things. First, as always, a quick shout out to one of my patrons. This one goes out to Eric Demeere. Eric, I've known Eric for a while now. He's been one of my patrons for a few years, but we actually know each other in person. Actually trained together at a seminar that I organized here in Belgium a few years ago. So Eric's a fellow instructor. Just wanted to say thanks to you, Eric, for your support. It means a lot and I appreciate it. And I just want to give you this shout out. So if you want to support the podcast, as always, go to wimsblog.com/donate. And there's many different ways, Patreon, PayPal, a bunch of stuff you can do. That keeps the show alive. So if you want to do that, that would be great. If not, you can also help out by just sharing this episode with anybody who might enjoy it. All right, that's it. So episode 51, our guest is Renee Dreifus. He's from New York. He's a really, really interesting martial artist. He fought in the original pretty much underground MMA days. He's a grappling expert, MMA coach, and many other things. I had a tremendously good time talking to him for this interview. I originally recorded it about half a year ago, just when the pandemic was breaking out. And then, like I explained in my previous podcast episode, that things got in the way, but I'm releasing it now. So I hope you guys enjoy it. It was a lot of fun talking to Renee. And as always, there's the bonus episode on my Patreon as well, which is also about an hour long, in which Renee is kind enough to answer the questions my patrons gave him. All right, we're going to jump right into the intro is a little bit abbreviated because I was talking about episode 50. This is episode 51. All right, folks, enjoy. I've got an amazing guest today. This is Renee Dreifus. Hey, Renee, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and it's really great to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here. For the people who don't know you, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. So you're the founder, head coach of Radical MMA in New York. You've got a pretty impressive background training since 1975. So that's a pretty long time for most of us. You lived in Japan. You practiced judo. You learned judo there, trained there really hard. You came back and to the US. You have a black belt in BJJ. You fought in MMA. You coach MMA. I mean, that's a pretty cool background and loads of hard training. So I was very happy that you agreed to be on the podcast. So I think this is going to be a really fun talk, and I am looking forward to picking your brain a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I started in 1975, and we had a previous conversation about our backgrounds, and yeah. I think you and I mirror each other in that we've been around the block and studied a lot of different martial arts. I think I don't even know exactly, but there's 18 different martial arts that I've kind of studied. I started out in knockdown karate, yeah, traditional karate under an instructor from Japan named Miyazaki Toyotaro. And he was known for, he had 3 matches with Chuck Norris, and it was, more went to Miyazaki. And that was in like more of a kickboxing kind of orientation that they used to have in the 70s, rather than the point karate that we do today. And then from there, I moved on to a lot of different styles, and but really found a home, found it important to add grappling to my repertoire. And I went through a number of different grappling martial arts, a little traditional jiu-jitsu, judo. I moved to Japan in 92, and I started doing judo there, but that was when, 93 was when the UFC hit. And already in Japan, there was a proto-MMA movement. I think what was going on in Brazil, what was going on in Japan, and to a lesser extent, Russia with the military and Sambo, was very similar in that they were experimenting with mixed martial art, minimal rules contests. And so I was on the ground. I was at ground zero of that movement, and started doing shoot wrestling and Shuto there. And a little bit, a lot of the people I was training with were a little bit more Sambo influenced, because that was what it was back then. And then unfortunately, I got hit by a car. I suffered a serious injury, and I had to leave Japan. But that was kind of fortuitous because I got back and I started training with the Machado organization. Originally, I met the Machado brothers, Higa Machado, who were cousins of the Gracies in California because my sister was living in California. I live in New York, though, so I was training under an affiliate, but would make trips to California very often. And then eventually that culminated me moving to Brazil and staying there for a very short time. But I was there and trained there with some really impressive people. Had a very big impact on my game. And of course, like you said, I felt like I had to test myself in mixed martial arts. But it really wasn't the rules we do today. It was Vale Tudo. Most of my matches allowed headbutts, groin shots. Hair pulling was 100% legal. The only thing that you couldn't do was bite or eye gouge, and so that was the rules that I competed under most of my matches. And I never thought I would do martial arts as a vocation because, to me, there wasn't so much of a how do I say? There's a lot of schools in New York at the time where it was. It's difficult for me to say, but they were bullshit schools. Like they're saying they're going to teach one thing and they didn't, and that was the landscape was littered with people like this. McDojos and things like that.
Yeah.
And it was really off-putting, and to me it seemed like the financial concerns of an academy dropped the quality of the training. So much so that it lost relevance in the catering to people's whims and desires for belts and ego and things like that, and rather than actual training. So I never thought I would actually teach. But as MMA got more popular and people saw, what real training, hard training looked like, there seemed to be a segment of people who were very interested and actually I started teaching privately while I was going to grad school to people who were just interested. And it seemed to be, privately, okay, there's this group. But then, 2 people became 10 people, 10 people became more. And little by little, I realized that, one, I enjoyed doing this much more than my previous job, which was as a translator for a long time. I speak Japanese, and I was translating Japanese for Japanese government and a number of other organizations. But I enjoyed it much more. It was really my passion. I loved it. And I was hired as an assistant instructor, and then that moved on to becoming opening up my own academy almost 7 years, six and a half years ago. And I mean, I had my own team for a while, my own fight team, but I really opened my academy about 6.5 years ago, and I have not worked a day since. I just love what I do. I found my passion and my bliss, and to me, I don't define MMA as the modern mixed martial art rules. I define it in the more context of Bruce Lee, and where it was like, let us erase the divisions, the definitions of these classical styles. Why are we limiting ourselves to painting in one color? We can paint in many colors to create a portrait and express ourselves as artists. So I define it as the highest performing techniques from the highest performing arts combined in a synergistic way and applied to a variety of combative contexts. And when I say that, I mean, we could talk about street self-defense, we could talk about rape defense, we could talk about, and I have a sizable number of these students who were posted to Iraq and Afghanistan in the military concerns, and also sportive training where you go into the cage or the octagon or what have you. And again, I have a number of these students where you have people who are dealing with emotionally disturbed individuals in psychiatric wards or LEOs where they have certain restrictions on what they're allowed to do in terms of use of force, but they still have to defend themselves and take care of the scenario. So for me, that to me is what mixed martial art is, not the rules of the current UFC or ONE FC or what have you. It's a concept of being an adaptable fighter and drawing from a lot of different tools to be the most effective combat athlete you can be. And so that's kind of, what my journey is.
That's pretty cool. And I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of the dream for many martial artists, is to go to Japan, live there, and then get training in the motherland. So can you talk a little bit about what was that like, living in Japan, and what was the good, the bad, the ugly? I mean, anything that comes to mind, just your life there. What was it like?
A lot of sushi and tofu.
No, where exactly did you live in Japan? Was that in Tokyo?
Yes, yeah. I lived in Tokyo. I traveled all around Japan, but I was based in Tokyo. And I actually this is completely by chance, but I moved to Japan and got a place living with a number of Aikido practitioners, because where I lived was very, very close to a Yoshinkan style of Aikido. They had a headquarters, and they had a instructor training program that was a year where people would go to Japan, and then we wound up all living together completely by chance. And we I became very good friends with some of those practitioners, and so we had this great martial art experience together, even though we were coming from very different styles. And at that time, when I first got to Japan, I was still interested in training traditional karate along with judo, but I was very disappointed in what I found in some styles. My base style was not Kyokushin. It was knockdown, but it was more from the Shotokan style. And, Shotokan, it seemed like they were much more rooted in tradition and in their own little niche world. And the traditional karate is like that in Japan, where they're all balkanized into these tiny little groups, and they really don't associate with each other that much. Kyokushin's maybe a little bigger and different, but and eventually I became very good friends with the Kyokushin people and trained with them as well. But at that time, I was just disappointed in how inward looking a lot of the traditional arts in Japan were, even though in their own disciplines they did train quite hard. So I made a decision to kind of leave karate behind, and actually it's funny because they would tell me very often, that's not karate, that's kickboxing. That's not karate, that's kickboxing. And I'm like, but I can beat you. But they're like, it's not allowed. You can't do this. You can't do that. Particularly things like low kicks and it just my instructor always had a more freestyle approach. And also one thing I was always blessed with, my instructor grew up in, some people don't know, but we had, the American kickboxing movement, Benny the Jet. Yeah. It's kind of a long time ago, but he grew up in that time where PKA, Professional Karate Association, professional kickboxing was really big, and helped coach some fighters. So he always had a very open mind. And when I was 11 years old, I asked him, I said, what should I do to get better? He said, you should really study boxing. And I said, hey, I'm interested in grappling. He's like, great, you go do it. He never was closed-minded about styles. And he said, this is when I was 11 years old, he said, Renee, to be a complete martial artist, you must travel outside of your house. You must experience other things. And only when you travel outside of your house do you understand what your house actually is. And when I entered Japan, I was a little disappointed with the karate world because it was so different from my sensei's, ideals. I said, okay, let me travel outside the house and really, really go in depth in judo. I'd already been training judo somewhat, but it was a backseat to my striking. And then I just went headfirst into grappling. And through judo, I interacted with a lot of people who were in the freestyle grappling orientation, and it was really interesting. So that's how I got interested in shoot wrestling and cross training in what I would call mixed grappling styles. So it wasn't like we were doing jiu-jitsu, it wasn't like we were doing judo. We were doing grappling of any origin. And I also was, continuing my training in traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu. But my primary training was for a good time judo. And the style that I trained there was Kosen judo mostly, because I met this guy at the Kodokan. And to me, I had a little bit more orientation toward throwing, as most judo people do. And especially coming from a karate background. You know, you want to stand up, you want to go to the ground. And but I saw this little man, you know, like a jacked Yoda. I mean, when he was in his 60s and he was jacked with the six-pack, and he said, "Oh, have you ever done some ground fighting?" And he used the word newaza. And, you know, I'm like, I was like, newaza. You know, I knew what it was a little bit, but the judo I'd done in the year before was so foreign to me. It almost, was speaking Japanese, it didn't click. Like, you know, when you speak a foreign language and someone says a word and it takes a little time to respond. And I'm newaza. And I'm like, sure. And he pulls me to the ground and proceeds to choke me to near unconsciousness. And he says, you know, come train with me more. I like you. And he used to call me American champion, even though I had no championship whatsoever. And his name was Hirata Kanai, and he was the last of the Kosen judo lineage. And he became one of my great teachers, along with a Brit by the name of Stephen Blower, who is still today I consider my master, who lived in Japan for 40 years and has some of the most beautiful and amazing judo I've ever experienced. So I had a lot of different training through these two wonderful people that introduced me to so many amazing fighters, and I was mostly based in the Kodokan. But thanks to these two great instructors who allowed me to go other places, I trained in the Newaza Kenkyukai, which was the school of Hirata School, where it was all groundwork all the time, and we trained very, very seriously. And it was very, very intense. It was exactly like you picture it, in very Spartan, very old school. I remember it was the middle of the summer, and we're just training in what's called Shochi Geiko, which is the summer intense camp, summer training, and the air conditioner just got shut off, the windows are closed. And he's like, let's go. And I looked down at my feet because I'd been doing, some stand-up grappling training. And I saw there was probably an inch puddle deep of sweat around my feet to the point where I'm like, I'm more swimming, because the old mats had absorbed so much sweat that they just couldn't absorb anymore. And there are these just deep puddles in these, century-old almost tatami mats. And it was just unbelievable. It took me to a mental place where training had not before, because it was in the Kodokan it was a little more modern because it was very like Olympic sport oriented. It was very much like, okay, let's do tabatas and scientific and this and that. And then when you went to the more traditional judo academy, it was all old school, what they say in Thailand, chop wood and carry water. They're just like, Spartan guts training, and that is something I carry with me to this day, in that it changed me as a person, it changed me as a fighter, and it really was the martial path. And that's when I talk about like what's bullshit. It's people sell the Kung Fu Bruce Lee path, and by that I don't mean a style, but I mean like, okay, you walk into a school, and it could be any martial art, it doesn't matter. And it could be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it could be anything. But they say, I'm going to change you. I'm going to create from this clay that you give me now, I'm going to create something different and special, and you're going to blossom into a better version of yourself. That's the promise that we as martial art instructors make. But they don't say that to do that, you have to train very, very hard. They don't say that. They say, oh, I'm going to pretend to train you hard and pretend to teach you these skills and pretend to do that, but I'm really not. What I really want to do is just make you happy and take your money. Yeah. And in Japan, it was not like that. First of all, judo is supported by the government. So I paid the equivalent of $4 a month to train at the Kodokan. And Hirata Sensei ran a taxi stand, a taxi company. And his dojo was on top of the taxi company, so he was independently wealthy. So there was just a little bit of like a donation box to cover some, things if you had to do. So you just put things in the donation box if you could, and if you couldn't, it didn't matter, because it was just martial arts. It was pure. There was no financial element to it whatsoever. It was not sullied by the more mercenary, concerns of, a modern, economic, capitalism. And to me, that was what made it so pure, and also made the instructor say, hey, you don't like it, there's the door. So suddenly, the student doesn't have the power, the instructor has the power, in a good way, not a bad way. In America, the instructor's like, oh, I have to pay the rent, so I can't be too hard on these guys because they'll quit. And so the training, little by little just becomes, bullshit. And I see it. I've seen it in Taekwondo. I've seen it in karate. I've seen it in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And whereas there are these promises of self-improvement and growth and self-actualization, you cannot have that without that hard training. And to me, that was instrumental in my growth as a human being, not just as a fighter. And I thank the fates that I met these two wonderful instructors, and they also, and there were so many great training partners I had there. The training in Japan was absolutely fantastic. A lot of people say that Japan, there's some maybe race element. I'll tell you, I never experienced any racism whatsoever on the mat ever. I only experienced brotherhood, camaraderie, and a dedication to training that was wonderful. And my goal in New York is to bring a little piece of that, to people in America, a little piece of that real feeling of training. And to me, Karate Sensei said, if you ever want to open a school, you can open up a school, but just do it right. And that's what I try to do. And that was one of my experiences there. It was absolutely fantastic. The other thing that I noticed, and this is something that Japanese have, not just in martial arts, but in everything, is an attention to detail, an attention to focus, and a self-motivating focus towards what they do, perfectionism. Whether, it's, in the automotive sector, the parts break down less, the Japanese cars, than almost any other car. Whether it's and I was in the translation sector, so, this had to be perfect. There's a level of focus and detail and pride in your work that it permeates every element of Japanese society, and it definitely has that. You feel that in any martial art you train in Japan, where it's a question of self-respect, where you will really hone your technique, and in that way, a lot of Japanese are self-motivated. And that was a wonderful thing, to be so precise and committed to technical excellence, So those are the two elements of my experience in Japan that I absolutely love. I could probably go on, about Japan forever. It's definitely not utopia in the sense that there's a lot of things that, living in Japan was not fun. In some ways, it was really great in others. Like any city, like any place, like Belgium, like New York, there's always the good and the bad. But in terms of the martial arts, the experience I had was unbelievable. And I couldn't have asked for better teachers and a better experience.
And I think you touched on it already with what you just said, is that the training is very different in Japan than what you see in the West, whether it's Europe or the US. I mean, not always, but in many cases it is. And just recently, there's this TV show every week here where they take a bunch of Olympic athletes from the past, and people who are long retired or recently retired, and some even still active, and they talk about what it's like to be in the Olympics. And there was, I don't know if you remember him, Robert van der Wallen. It's a Belgian judoka. He won gold in the Olympics in Moscow in the 80s. And they asked, okay, what was it like to train in Japan? And what many people don't know, I knew it already, but is that was in the late 70s and 80s, so it was not like it is now.
No.
And he went to work in a metal smelting factory for 2 months to save up enough money to buy a ticket, go to Japan, stay there in this crappy apartment, and just train all day long. And I said, what was it like? And he said, they just beat me up, like from morning until late at night. Every training session, they just beat you up. That was it, and they smash you to the floor. You can't breathe, and just get up, stop complaining, get up, and keep on training. and that was just how it was. And he said,
I'll tell you, I had a little bit of a funny experience because the minute I walked into the Kodokan, of course I put on a white belt. I was a white belt in judo. I was a black belt in karate, and a number of styles of taekwondo and 2 styles of karate. But I put on a white belt because I had been doing judo, but I wasn't very experienced. But they put me in because I was a foreigner. It wasn't a racial thing. It was just the foreigners that visit the Kodokan are almost always Olympians, or Olympic hopefuls. So there's regular class of Japanese people who are not Olympians. They're just Japanese people who want to do judo, and they enjoy the sport and they like to compete, but they're the regular person's class, right? And it was still very hard training, but obviously it's different from people who are getting ready for the Olympics. But the majority of foreigners at that time, this is very different today. Tokyo did not have many foreigners in it. But when I got there, the majority of people were very, very serious about their judo and their martial art, training. So I walk into the Kodokan, they put me in the foreigners division, which is basically the Olympic, hopeful division. And on my first day, they, proceed to destroy me. And then I didn't take my break fall as well as I should have in one of the throws. And the one of the people, his name was Tef. He was from Malaysia. He was in the World Championships and he's winner of the ASEAN Games and the Asian Games. And he said, "Are you what's your experience? Where you're from America?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "But you're a black belt, right?" And I'm like, "No, I'm a white belt." He's like, "Oh, I thought you just took your black belt off out of respect." And he's like, "Because that's like the worst break fall I've ever seen." And I'm like, "No, I'm a white belt, And they were making fun of me because basically the break fall that they were trying to do was a one-handed cartwheel break fall. So you don't actually fall.
Yeah.
You just one-handed cartwheel out, which is, something, I couldn't do. And they were like, "Why can't you do this?" And so as soon as I told them that I was an actual white belt, that I was not a black belt, and I was not an Olympic hopeful, they didn't beat me up. That I didn't have that in the beginning. They gave me a very step-by-step and introduction to judo. I'd already been training before, but obviously they had their own technical, Japan has their own technical requirements. So they had me just focus on one move for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, just constant repetition over and over and over again. I remember it was the first one I did was Ippon Seinaga, which is one-arm throw, and I probably drilled that, and I'm not exaggerating here, 10,000 times at least before they even let me do another throw. And so it wasn't like they smashed me in the beginning. It was more like, we'll just, run you through fundamentals until you just want to scream, which was great. And it's a great way of training. I call it no ADHD training. It's like you're going to do one thing and you're just going to do it not till you get it right. You do it until you can't get it wrong.
Yeah.
And so that was my experience. And then when I was ready for the smash, they gave it to me, but I never felt them haze me or like beat me down when I wasn't ready for it. That being said, when I got to the point I was ready, the guns came out, and I think this is a very different experience than I had from that person because you were already an Olympian. When the guns came out, you did 70 rounds straight of randori sparring, nonstop, and if you drop, you have to stop, then you didn't come back. That was the way it was. But it's also, it was a time, the 90s were a time where the Japanese really were not winning at the level they wanted to in judo. And so they were understanding that they had to also be scientific in their training, and that just that old school guts training, important, but also they didn't want to like develop repetitive stress injuries or things. So they were trying to be more scientific. And that was actually a good balance. You know, we had hard training, but it was also scientific in the sense that, you know, you started doing a lot of, like I said, the Tabata protocols. You started allowing water. You know, before you could not drink at all during training. This is not possible. No drinking. But when I was there, they had these large kettles of water, and you know, they would a little bit frown sometimes. But if you needed water, you need to hydrate, you just hydrated. And that was actually a much safer way of doing it because, you know, the people weren't dropping, you know, down from, you know, heat exhaustion.
Yeah, that was also my experience when I started with my Kung Fu training. My teacher was very much old school, and we actually trained in this old factory. So there was just underneath the roof with these tiny square windows, if you can remember what factories were like that back then. And there were like 50 windows and only one could open. And in the winter it was freezing, and in the summer it was just boiling hot, and we weren't allowed to drink no water because his mindset was like, you know, you got to toughen up. So I remember coming home from a 2-hour training session and just drinking and drinking until I almost fell over. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in many traditional arts still today that is not necessarily based on science as we know it now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, it's funny because sometimes you have to skirt that. Like, I believe that we have to have that sort of scientific training, but at the same time, if you don't do that hard old school training, you lose some of the spirit or the seishin, you know, the seishin yoku, you know, the spiritual strength that you have in from that. I think it builds some sort of, you know, for lack of a better word, character, combat. You know, iron, a little bit of flint and iron in your soul, and that happened to me. I'll tell you. I won't say his name because he's a very famous judoka, but you know, he and he's still alive today. And you know, he felt that I was being disrespectful or a little bit arrogant at one point, you know, and so he just said, "Okay, I'm gonna do randori with him, I'm gonna spar with you." And it was old school, and he just smashed me down. And this is a person who's, you know, he's a judo god, right? You know, it's like he's not just the person who won the Olympics. He's like, you know, judo god, and smashed me down, pinned me in side control. Never hurt me. Let me understand that, because listeners, he never hurt me, but he smashed me in side control in a way that I've never been put before. Held me in judo. When you hold someone for 30 seconds. That's it. You win. So 30 seconds pass. He doesn't let me go. A minute passes. He doesn't let me go. 5 minutes passes, and I'm struggling to get out. And now I'm like, you know, hey, could you let me go? Not answering, not talking to me, you know, pretending like he doesn't hear me, or not even pretending, you know, because I couldn't see his face, you know. And he's just smashing me harder and harder and harder. And at that point, I was, you know, 160 pounds, and he was, you know, about 200 and something. And also with the technique of a, you know, 1 million judoka on the planet, and just smashing me. 5 minutes goes to 10 minutes. At this point, I'm, you know, freaking out, and he's soaking wet gi was over my face, so I was actually being waterboarded, you know, because I was ingesting his sweat through his gi. And he just would rub that gi into my face and cover my mouth with his wet gi. And then, you know, 10 minutes become 15 minutes. And I'll be honest, I broke. At that point, I started crying and begging him to let me go. Didn't let me go. And then I lost it. You know, you just become animalistic. And I'm trying to, like, I bite him and I gouge him. And nothing happening. And finally, he holds me. I don't actually know how long he held me. I just know it was past 20 minutes. I urinated myself. And then I passed out, and they woke me up in the nurse's office, and it was really, really embarrassing. And people think that's like abusive, but it was old school. And let me tell you, I was very afraid. I always avoided him. Anytime I saw him, I always avoided him. I was very scared of him after that. But he didn't mean it in a negative way. It was just the way things were done, and I thank him for doing that. Because I felt the side control of some of the top fighters in the world, including Higa Machado and other people who Marcelo Garcia is one of my teachers and jiu-jitsu master. I felt crushing side control from people who are known to make others tap in side control. But they just break them in side control or pin or any pin. I never break. I do not break because of that one experience. Nothing comes close to that level of fear that I felt there. Nothing. So that I have this massive bandwidth of experience that other people don't have. And that to him was every day, because like you said, he went through the 70s and the 60s. And you know, that hard stuff builds something inside your soul that you can never take away. So being too scientific, being too oriented towards, oh, this is how you stop injury, and that defeats the purpose of what we're trying to do. Because in a combat context, if you don't have the will to go to another place where your assailant, you know, life or death, your assailant is, and you don't have that mental strength, it doesn't matter what that crap you do in terms of technique. I don't care, you do karate, judo, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, kung fu, it doesn't matter. If you don't have that iron will to persevere and push through, you're dead. And this is one reason why I think wrestlers do so well in MMA. Is in America, wrestler is a little bit less technical and much more guts training. So most of the people at the highest level of wrestling have that same kind of Spartan iron will. And it's zero. I didn't see the wrestling training in America. It's the Dan Gable style of wrestling is not scientific at all. It's let's cut weight for an entire season, basically. You know, you cut weight, compete, eat back, cut weight again. And you train like a maniac, and you redline your body for so long, it just becomes natural, and it is what it is. And your ability to persevere, the level of grit and resilience that you develop is insane. And you know, the modern sort of scientific thing is absolutely important, but I think we cannot lose the balance of that old school training to develop the mental strength of and connect to our warrior soul.
Well, I think for large parties, it's a lot of the old school stuff. When I talk about, you know, how I was trained when I started out, nowadays, like you said, you know, people would call that abuse, and there's no way I could do some of that stuff with my students today, because I'd have the police sent to my class. So I think a lot of it is that also people don't understand the context of why certain things are done, and that there is always abuse in the sense that, you know, teachers who take it too far, and there's some bad dudes out there who teach, and they're quite good, but they're bad dudes. But a lot of it is also, I mean, I remember, I don't know if you saw that, there's this clip of Satoru Sayama,
yes,
judo, who's basically
absolutely
beating up his students with sticks.
Yeah.
And yelling at them.
And, you know, I train with those guys, you
Yeah.
know, and I'll tell you, you know, this is not politically correct to say, but there's a reason why Satoru Sayama got kicked out of Shuto. Because he was an asshole, and he was a dick, and he was a jerk, and that kind of training was not, you know, that's that kind of training. I never experienced that in judo. I experienced hard training, but again, it built me up. It didn't break me down. It built me into something more, and I think it comes down to what the instructor's intentions are, you know, and you're right. There's a lot of bad instructors out there who use so-called hard methods, but you know, just as an ego experiment. But you know, I see that more in the West now. It's not as common, obviously, because you can't do that anymore. But and you know, you saw it in Japan too. I honestly did not experience that kind of abusive thing in the functional martial arts. In the martial arts that were not functional, I did see it, or less functional, you know, and I'm going to call a spade here. You know, this is going to, you know, anger some people, but there's a lot of frauds in Japan too, and particularly in the ninjutsu world, and that it's just a bunch of baloney, and it's also I think they use that old school mentality as a way to control people rather than build them up. So I never experienced any abuse in the sense that it was just to put me down and break me down. That was a unique experience that I had from that instructor. That was not my day-to-day experience. It was always, helping me become a better version of me, but pushing me and coaching me, not putting me down and abusing me. But there was no toleration for weakness. There was just not, that was not tolerated.
Yeah. If I could just quickly interject, because there's one thing I want to add to this. The thing I also see is that if you compare, for instance, some of the really harsh training that you see in traditional styles to, for instance, military training or special forces training, to be exact, a lot of the martial arts stuff is just really weak in comparison to what these guys have to go through. Where we talk about, just the physical exhaustion and pushing yourself beyond limits, and then beyond the limits you thought you just passed.
You're absolutely right, and I would say not only is it the same in the military arts, but I come from a family of physicians, and any physician will tell you that their first year of residency is, you don't sleep. You're pushed into a level of exhaustion and discomfort that it just almost breaks you, because it's the same thing when you're on the front lines, and we see that today. When you're on the front line and dealing with life or death, you have to have a certain level of internal strength, and the only way you do that is by redlining yourself to some extent. And this goes back to any athletic performance. You talk about the what makes an athlete win in the highest levels of competition, and it's at some level to go beyond the circuit breakers that we unconsciously set in our brain. So, for example, we have these things that says, if I go past this point, I'm going to injure my body. That's actually generally not true. But we have these unconscious circuit breakers that just kind of stop us. But your ability to turn those off, to blow through them, is what makes you a champion in any athletic sport. And I'm very lucky I know some people in the cycling world, and I had a next door neighbor who was also a very high level long distance runner. And I'll tell you an example with him, that I was on a bicycle, and he was and I was pushing it. He's outpacing me on a bicycle. And this was at the tail end of his run. I'm like, how can you do that? And he's like, I just do it. I mean, it was a level of speed that I'd never experienced. And you have to have that high level athletics. And it goes beyond special forces. It goes beyond anything. If you want to have a championship level of human potential, you have to break through those unconscious circuit breakers. Yeah. And then when you are on the front line, military, special weapons and tactics type people, ER doctors, you're going to do that on a regular basis. And if your training does not prepare you for that at some level, you will fail. You will fail. They say fatigue makes cowards of us all. Yeah. But it's also lack of mental strength will make you a coward. Yeah. And it's trainable. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to be, a special weapons and tactics or special forces guy. But if you are in the martial art, let's put a capital emphasis on martial. And if you're going to step in the cage under me in a team, because, at some level, MMA is very dangerous, you have to show me you have that mental strength. Yeah. And to me, that's important. That's what makes me understand that you're safe to be there. It's almost, so that's my point. And that's why I love the MMA world today, just because it still retains some of that, that kind of toughness. If you look at even people have no lineage to Japan whatsoever, say AKA, which is, more wrestling based, and while they have some striking, and they have some lineage to Japan as well, but they're more modern in their approach. You look at TriStar, you look at all these camps, but there's some incredibly hard training that goes on there, and that's just the way it is. And I would say the top level combat athletes of mixed martial arts demonstrate a level of will that is supremely strong. Not all of them, of course, and some of them break, and you can see that with Conor McGregor, where he didn't so much lose the technical battle, But in this fight against Habib, he tapped even before the choke was on.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things. I mean, people who haven't competed don't understand this in the same way than people who have, and you can explain it, but it's a huge difference between explaining it and actually living through it. I used to have a Russian nemesis when I competed. So I think he was world champion 3 times in Sancho. And I followed the first time, and I was 21. I actually turned 21 in Moscow, so that's a long time ago. And he was Russian, so he was competing for his home crowd in the European Cup. And I had the nationals the week before or 2 weeks before, I don't remember. And I injured my foot, so I had nothing to lose. So I was like, okay. So I draw him. So I'm like, okay, crap. There's a world champ right there, so I'm gonna fight that guy. So I do what you normally don't do in Sancho is start with fancy stuff. So the bell goes, I step up to him and I use a lead roundhouse kick and I kick him in the face. And you see his head snap back, and he was so surprised that for the rest of the fight he just couldn't get into it. He mentally he wasn't there. He was just off his game. I won that fight on points. It was a horribly ugly fight, but apparently I won it. And I still remember as I sat down that his coach slapped him in the face with a big towel. It's like, how could you lose from this nobody from Belgium? Fast forward a year or two, and I see him again at the World Championships in Malaysia, and he was pissed. He was pissed because we draw each other again. So first fight I face him. No, second fight, sorry. And I wasn't mentally ready. I was not for what I was about to face. I could see it in his eyes that he wanted to crush me. Because I'm pretty sure that back in those days, his martial arts career was basically his ticket to a better life, and I had pretty much almost taken that away from him. So he had something to set right, and I was not ready for that intensity, mentally speaking. So I wouldn't say I broke, but I couldn't keep up. First thing he did was pick me up and slam me to the floor, and I could feel muscles tear on the inside. I was like, holy crap. Fast forward a few more years, I lost that fight, obviously, and we meet again, and that was in Baltimore in the World Championships, and that was my last time I competed internationally. And I draw him again. I don't know who was doing the draw, but I kept on, getting that guy. And I knew that was the last time because I was in a relationship, wanted to start a family, and so on. There was no financial support back home for Sancho, so I was like, okay, there's nothing there. I have to, work. And I was like, this is the last time. And that time I was ready. So was he, but I was ready. So we saluted. I looked him in the eye. He looked back, and I did not back down that time. And I was like, I'm ready to die here with you, dude. So we fought really hard for 3 rounds. He won on points. I consider myself the moral victor because on the way back to the dressing room, he fainted 3 times, and I managed to stay on my feet. So I was like, if only you would have done that like a minute ago, I would have been so happy.
That is an amazing story.
Here's the point. It's all mental. It's all psychological. I won that first fight because I had nothing to lose. I lost the second one because psychologically speaking, I wasn't ready to face the intensity that he would bring. And the last time he didn't beat me because I refused to lose. And the model that I use is from Charles Staley, which is a hierarchy of training, which is in martial arts training. You can see it as a pyramid with the bottom and the widest part of the pyramid, the base, is physical training. On top of that, technical. On top of that, strategy and tactics. And they always get smaller. And the top level of the pyramid is the mental and psychological aspect. And that is supported by everything that is underneath it. It is the most important, but it's actually not what you train the most. You spend the most time basically getting in shape and getting your techniques and so on right. And then you go to the tactical and strategic level. But all of that is supported by your mental toughness, your endurance, your willpower, your desire, you have to burn on the inside to win that fight or to win that competition, and that is something that is extremely hard to explain unless you've experienced it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also interesting because, you have these interviews with a lot of top-level MMA fighters, and they're employing mental coaches, psychologists, sports psychologists, some hypnotists, and it just makes sense because why if I want to get stronger, I'm going to, hire a strength and conditioning coach. If I want to get more technical, I'm going to hire a striking coach or a grappling coach or whatever. If I want to train my brain, I'm going to hire an expert in that field. And to me, this is exactly where I want to take my academy forward. Is a scientific exploration of what we can do to maximize our mental toughness. And I've actually recently contacted, this all stopped because of the COVID-19 thing, but I recently contacted a sports psychologist who also does sports hypnosis for my fighters to get their mental game up. I actually am very blessed with some fighters who are mentally very strong, but very strong doesn't mean they've maxed out their mental potential. Yeah. And I think I would also like to learn from this person because you want to say that the ring experience is a high level of stress. Well, what about life or death? Unfortunately, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I had some experiences which an assailant was trying to murder me and trying to actually light me on fire and kill me. So I was very young at the time, and I had already been training karate, but it just kind of went out the window when through the fear and just the deer in headlights response. That we all talk about the sports psychology and the psychology of fear and the limbic system, and Tony Blauer has some great points on this and how this adrenaline rush and things. If you're not understanding how to control it, you just break down, and that's what happened to me. I almost died, and it was such a scarring experience that I never even spoke about it until more recently. Because it sort of just got packed up into a part of my brain that just I never talked about. And the same thing, I've had students who have horrible experiences with rape or attempted rape, and that's both male and female, and or abuse, child abuse, and they're carrying these things out. And to self-actualize, to become the true version of themselves, they have to unpack that box, and that is the realm of an expert. And so part of our martial training has to include the mental game. But the thing is, I don't have a PhD in psychology. And while a lot of the trainers that I dealt with in Japan they had some deep understanding of the human condition, of course they're not at the same level as someone who is clinically trained. So to me, the next evolution of our training in Radical is to hire, true experts in the mental field who can streamline our approach to mental and physical toughness. And of course, grit and old school training are certainly a part of that. But again, balancing that out with the scientific approach is to me, very, very important. And you can see that the top level fighters are all doing this now. And it's not just that. One of the great tennis players, Andre Agassi, he was like number 1, and then he dropped to like number 50, and he just kind of imploded. He just mentally got off the rails, and he hired a sports psychologist, and then he went right back up and started winning again. And then he said, not only was that important to get back on the horse as a champion, but he just learned a lot about himself, and he was grateful for that guy's mentorship, and he was like a true sensei or sifu in the sense that he taught him something more transcendental, more meaningful than just winning a game. He taught him about himself. And I think that's the path that we're on, and to me, this is kind of how I see it. You're absolutely right. There's the physical, the conditioning, the technical, the strategic, and the mental. And these are all things that we have to train our students in, particularly if you want to step in a ring, you want to be a law enforcement officer, or you want to step out of a crisis scenario, a personal assault, or like we have today, I have a lot of students here in New York who are being ravaged by COVID, but they're on the front lines as nurses and health workers, and they're working, 60-hour shifts and watching people die every day. How do you mentally get through this and help people? Well, you draw on some more internal reserves, and that's important to have that if you want to be functional in a crisis scenario. The Japanese have a word for this. It's called fudoshin, and it's immovable heart. And I don't mean heart. Heart is a synonym for mind, but it's equanimity in the face of stress. And this is the character of the samurai that is prized almost before everyone else. When the shit hits the fan, he doesn't lose it. He's still Clint Eastwood, calm, cool, collected, Navy SEAL, whatever image we have of the warrior. We could go back to the Spartan warrior. But the idea of being calm, cool, collected in the face of extreme circumstances is true warriorship. Whether it's oh, you want us to lay down our swords, come and take it, or you want to oh, I love the smell of napalm in the morning. However, all these archetypes of warriors that we have in pop culture, but it's the same thing. It's you don't let the fear take over. You don't let the self-doubt take over. You perform and you reach down and draw on that grit. And if you want to be a champion in the ring, you want to be a champion in life. To me, they're the same thing.
I think that's when you look at what's going on nowadays, especially in MMA, is that there's a lot of work on that front. I mean, how many times has John Jones been arrested? Just recently, once again. Conor McGregor couldn't stop himself from getting into trouble the last few years, and this is one of the things that I tend to. It's one of my rants. I competed back in the day in a sport that was not very popular in my country. I had pretty much no sponsoring or financial support from the government and that kind of stuff. So we were kind of like, okay, amateurs fighting against professionals, because the other countries, they sure had that. Now, I was very fortunate that I was allowed to travel the world and represent my country and compete and have those experiences. But I never took it for granted. Because it wasn't given to me. Let's call it that. When I see martial artists who can earn a really good living from competing, and then they act like divas that they are owed and this and that, and they get into trouble, they disrespect people, they act like they're all this and that. I just like, dude, you do not know how lucky you are. There's people who train a whole lot harder than you, and they've got zilch.
You're absolutely right. And I do not disagree with anything you said whatsoever. I'm 100% agreement. It's an embarrassment. And, for every, unfortunately, for every George St. Pierre, there's a Conor McGregor. For every Demetrius Johnson, there's John Jones, And to me, sometimes it's the curse of the athletically gifted, because they've been treated like prima donnas their whole life. And you can see that in like MMA is becoming sort of like basketball, where, they're grooming athletes and they kind of spoil them because they have such a athletic potential, but they create, mentally unbalanced people. And John Jones is probably one of the most athletically gifted kind of athletes I've ever seen, but he's also mentally bizarre. There's a fight where he didn't train the entire camp. It was against Gustafsson, because he wanted to have an excuse that if he lost, he could just say he didn't train, which is actually like a very common thing in mental weakness. I see that all the time in my academy, students who don't give 100% so they can have this like backwards rationalization of why they're not good enough. And I'm like, wow, that's that white belt mentality, that white belt, like on the terms of mental development, he's still white belt. But because he's so off the charts as an athlete, it's like his mental strength. It doesn't have to be tested so much. But I think in the last fight, he looked poor. His attributes are failing a little bit. They're getting older, and also people are catching up with the body type that test him. And it's only a matter of time that he's going to be mentally tested, and he will come up short, because he's just mentally not there. And but the other thing is, I agree with you 100%. But I cannot control the world. I can only control myself, and I cannot set moral or ethical boundaries for other people. I can only do that for myself. I can recommend, and also if you represent my flag, I expect a certain level of decorum and behavior if you represent my flag. But at the same time, we're dealing with a population out there who has a bunch of assholes and a bunch of people who are not. And this goes to the traditional world too. Like I told you, I was very friendly with a lot of people in the Aikido world. I'll tell you, I've never met so many jerks and people full of themselves as I have in the Aikido world. And then, it's like I can't believe how lack of spiritual enlightenment you guys actually have. That's not to knock that martial art. Of course, there's some nice people too, but every art has its jerks and its paragons of virtue. And particularly prize fighting, I think can also have an element of pandering to the crowd, so that harps up that drama, but I can't make a judgment, or I can make a judgment, but I can't make what's the word I'm looking for? I can't tell people how to live, so I'm not going to do that. Of course, I feel bad that our art is disrespected that way, and I love what Chappie Sittudong is doing in one. You will get thrown out of one if you act like John Jones and Conor McGregor. He's like, we're here to celebrate positive martial art virtues. So if you don't do that, you're out. And I love that. And but of course, America loves their WWE, this sort of circus culture. Our TV's dominated by all this behavior that is off the charts idiocy, and it's just sort of I think part of what makes America kind of ridiculous sometimes, but that's a whole nother story. But it's a part of MMA, and it's a part of America, and it's unfortunate. But I will behave in a certain way. I'll expect my fighters to behave in a certain way, and I will also surround myself with people like you and others who behave in that way. And those who don't, what can you say? I think you're embarrassing yourself and whatever. It's unfortunate. But there's nothing you can do about it, and you can only be responsible for who you are. And as there's a slice of humanity, you're always going to get that slice that acts like Chael Sonnen and and all these people that just act like buffoons. So, or Kobe Covington, they're just disgusting behavior. So it is what it is.
What I wanted to say is that it's like you said, it's WWE. It's selling fights. Boxing's had it for a long time as well, and though I've got the impression that it's gotten better compared to where it was before, but MMA really jumped on that train. Charleston was one of the first guys to play the heel, and he's quite good at it. Kobe Covington kind of took on his role, and Conor McGregor took it to a whole new level. But it sold fights, and that's and one of the biggest issues I see right now, that UFC is and people forget in the West, sure, UFC is huge, but one in Asia is at the very least just as big, if not bigger. So
and they do it. That's exactly what I'm saying. They do it without compromising
exactly
martial virtues, and so I absolutely love how they're doing that. And to some extent, if you look at the majority of the top guys in MMA, Stipe Miocic, I mean, the guy is a legitimate hero. He doesn't quit his job as a fireman and risks his life all the time. This guy is legitimate. Super humble. Again, Kamaru Usman. You get a lot of. I don't know that much about him, but he seems to act very well. Of course. Demetrius Johnson is one of my favorites. You have a lot of people who you could say, wow, these guys are acting in ways that I really respect, and they're carrying themselves like martial artists. Then on the other side, you have others. But I guess it's human. Human life. You're going to get X and you're going to get Y. And like I said, that's not just MMA. Every martial art I have ever experienced with the karate world, and I can count on more than one hand how many complete jerks I've met who I was like, wow, I cannot believe you're in an instructor capacity, because you're truly an awful human being.
Yeah.
And Aikido world, in the, whatever martial art I've been in, there's always been a subset of people who you wouldn't want to train with, and it would hurt you. Like you said, we had this conversation before. You walk into an academy, and instead of welcoming you and hugging you, they just want to break you and prove a point. I've seen that in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've seen it in MMA. I've seen it everywhere. But the funny thing is, I've met less of those people in MMA than you would think, and I've met more of those people in the traditional arts than you would think. Because the traditional arts are all about, especially I was very big in the Taekwondo world in the 80s and in the late 80s and early 90s. I competed on the national level in the intramural, the collegiate teams. And Taekwondo has this, idea of as a traditional martial art. Let's put away effectiveness or whatever, but it's, known as a traditional art. Obviously, it's really not that old, but whatever. But it harkens back to some of these values. And I have never seen so many John Jones type prima donnas in my life. And they, with behavior that is just off the wall. And it is complete. There's one of the reasons why I was like, I had enough of this. I can't deal with that. So, every art has it. And unfortunately, because we're made up of flawed human beings, that's what it is. But that's, I think, what makes the greats the great, that they transcend that. And they have some sort of character qualities that are so amazing,
Yeah. My main art is Tai Chi Chuan. So we have our fair share of when you talk about some of the Aikido guys, Tai Chi has as a large majority of those guys as well. And one of the good things about combat sports, like whether it's MMA or kickboxing or Muay Thai and so on, is that you can say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, there's the ring, there's a cage, you can go and prove it. Whereas in many traditional arts, that's not really how it works. And, to a large degree, that's understandable. We teach weapons in my style, so it wouldn't really be very effective to settle every single argument or discussion with, okay, let's take our spears and sabers out and just hack each other to pieces and see who's right. It's not Game of Thrones, so that can't work. So you have that limitation obviously then also allows for a lot of blowhards and guys who are believing their own publicity. Those guys, that's fertile ground for them to flourish, which is one of the main reasons why I have drawn back completely here in Belgium from all federations and that kind of stuff. I teach my classes. You want to show up, that's fine. You don't want to show up, that's fine. Me and my students were doing our thing, and I don't want anything to do with anybody else who is interested in drama and all that kind of nonsense. So I totally get where you're coming from.
No, that's wonderful, and I had the same thing. It's funny because I've withdrawn my academy from all the federations too, because I'm not interested in playing politics. I'm just interested in having our athletes test each other and being better athletes and walking the walk and talking the talk. And that's it. And yeah, so it's so interesting how we came to the same conclusion, and it's just one of the reasons why I respect you so much, because you're
same here. And for the people who are listening, we talked about this just before, but the way I heard about Renee was two ways actually. The first one was that I was one of my students was practicing BJJ, and he told me about his technique, and I hadn't heard of it before. And I looked it up, and I stumbled upon one of your YouTube videos. I think that's Ihao back in the day. So I was like, hey, this is good. This guy teaches well, and it was clear, good instruction, and so on. And recently I found them back again. So that was the first way. But the second was we have a mutual friend, Barry Eisler, and Barry and I train together as much as we can. But usually I go to his place for a while, and then we train every day. And we were talking about grappling because that's also one of his things. And we got talking, and I said, look, it's very difficult for me to go to a class or a gym or whatever back home, because I've experienced it so many times. It was mostly in Muay Thai and kickboxing gyms, but in grappling arts it's also an issue sometimes, where they see that you've got some experience, you're a big, strong guy. They put you with the biggest, strongest, baddest guy they have, and then it's a full-on spar right away, and you end up injured. I'm 48. I've got a bunch of injuries. I can't afford that kind of nonsense anymore. I also can't afford that you're, working with somebody and it's not even sparring, but this guy is annoyed that he can't have his way with you like he can with any beginner, even if I do have a white belt on. But I do have 35 years of training and a bunch of stuff. So that he gets annoyed and all of a sudden just cranks the lock or the choke too hard and he snaps my knee. And I'm like, nope, I'm not doing that. And anyway, and Barry said, well, if you ever come to New York, there's this guy I know, and he's got a great academy, great teacher, and his guys are not at all like that. And that was you. So I was like, okay, so if I'm ever in New York, that's where I'm gonna go. And also, I gotta say, shout out to Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in Monterey, California. They were very welcoming to me last year when I went to the beginners class, which is a lot of fun. Very, very respectful people, and that was a great class. I enjoyed it tremendously. Wanted to give a shout out to those guys as well. So that's how we got to know each other. I'm going to switch tacks now. So what kind of advice would you give to young competitors that are just starting out? What are some do's and don'ts?
Great.
It doesn't matter if it's MMA or BJJ. It doesn't matter.
Well, I think this goes beyond any style. It's like first of all, what is your goal in the martial arts? And do you want, find a teacher who, echoes that goal. Like if you want to compete, well, you have to find a teacher who's willing to support you and, in that venture. So I would say that, obviously, and for me, I was very lucky to be surrounded by teachers who were always supportive of what I wanted to do. So it even goes back to, the 70s where, like I said, cross training was anathema. Like you couldn't do that. It was like such a betrayal. Except my instructor, Mr. Miyazaki, was like, no, of course, cross training. That's great. Like he was that kind of open-minded person. And so you have to understand, you have to see that your instructor mirrors your goals. I would say that. But then the other thing is, just commit. It sounds weird. I go back to Kung Fu Panda #1. This is the best martial art movie ever made. There is no secret ingredient. There's just training. Consistency is the foundation of your strength, is what Hirata Sensei said to me. Show up at the academy minimum 4 days a week. And train and have a sense of mindfulness when you train. Everybody talks about aliveness, that we have to train hard and this and that. And of course you want to train hard. But the aspect of this is you have to drill, you have to move with a sense of mindfulness of how your body is actually moving. What is it actually doing? How am I developing leverage? How am I going? Really have an internal, almost like treat martial arts like yoga. What am I doing here? What am I doing there? There's, the highest level actors. It's interesting because a lot of like guys in my academy are actors. They've been on a lot of TV shows and things like that. And so I don't have an acting bone in my body, but I respect their craft because they're very, very high level at what they do. And they have this thing called the Alexander technique. And it's basically like, for lack of a better word, coordination and proprioception. Basically understand your body to manipulate it in different ways to present a different character or just do things with your body in different ways. And the same thing is, I have another friend, and he's an incredible Muay Thai fighter, but he went into the Pilates world, and everything is about body control. And then in the jiu-jitsu world, you look at Rickson Gracie doing his gymnastica natural and his movement and his breathing. And again, it's body control. So that I would say it doesn't matter what martial art you're doing, but there has to be a focus on precision and an internal understanding of your body as a athletic machine, a combat athletic machine. What am I doing here? What am I doing there? Don't just do the techniques rote. And this is one of the things that, and I'm not here to trash traditional martial arts karate, but a lot of times I would do the drills that my instructor gave me, and this is my fault, not his, But it is kind of part and parcel of what karate is. You do these drills, but you don't really think. You just kind of turn your mind off. It doesn't matter if you're doing karate. It doesn't matter if you're doing jiu-jitsu. It doesn't matter if you're doing judo. Don't turn your mind off. And that was one thing I learned in Japan, where it's like, think about what you're doing. Think about how to do it properly. Think about when to do it. Think about the why behind it. And when you have those how, when, and why, you really improve tremendously. So to me, I spent many years training, and I'm just going to say it right here. I trained very hard in karate, and I sucked crap. It just was like, I was just bad. I was not an athletic kid. I was not. I grew up with a father who was a Jewish Holocaust refugee from Germany, and for him there was nothing more important than academics. Athletics, the only athletic pursuit we ever did in my home was skiing, and that was just for the winter season, and in the summer we did bicycling, or we would kind of go like hiking, but not hiking like hard hiking, more like you cross country walk. There's nothing like baseball, football, basketball, cricket, rugby, none of these like high level hand-eye coordination things. So when I was a young child, I was way behind developmentally in terms of hand-eye coordination. So when I played sports with my peers, I was terrible. And the hand-eye coordination bled into karate, that it was a very hard road for me, because a year of training and I would get to X level, right? And then some would be in a month and they would get to X level. So it was a very hard road to have that. And so because I had that lack of coordination, lack of athleticism, and then also the training I never engaged my mind. I just did what I was told. I was like a little bit of a robot, which again is sort of like what karate kind of has. It's the more militarized aspects. It has to do with the history of Japan and how karate was used as sort of like what we call ROTC, which is like in America, like what you do before you go to the military. It wasn't about karate. It was about developing, infantrymen. So they changed a lot of things and made it like less mindful and more repetitive, so that you just do what you're told. And but that being said, there was also responsibility on my part that I was not thinking about what I was doing, just repeating. And when you just repeat without thought, you don't improve. So the idea is your instrument is your weapon. Your body is your instrument. So if you are not honing every aspect of that weapon, conditioning and mental training and the whys of what you do it, then you won't improve. So to me, the real interesting element of martial arts and what makes it work is a development of higher levels of leverage. And you can see this in boxing. Nobody punches harder than the highest levels of technical boxers. Or just, and you compare it, like the level of force that is out there as a high level modern combat athlete compared to, fighting John Sullivan in 1901 whatever, or Jack Johnson, but like it's not even on the same scale. Just like the person who went to the Olympics for a marathon in 1920 compared to today, they wouldn't be on the same scale. And so it's this quest for higher levels of leverage and effectiveness. And so to me, it doesn't matter what martial art you're doing, you're constantly honing and sharpening that blade so you can deploy higher levels of leverage and effectiveness. And the way you do that is first by thinking about what you're doing and what your body is as your tool, as your instrument. And so don't be a robot. Think how, why, when, where. All these questions. What am I doing with my body? Why am I doing it? When do I do it? How do I do it? What is the meta of everything? And when you start thinking about what you're doing, engaging your mind, like Bruce Lee said, you're just going to become a much better athlete, a much better fighter. And it's probably more interesting, and you won't burn out as less either, because it's not boring.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. And it's one of the things I tell my students, both my Tai Chi and MMA students, like, okay, ask questions. Every single time I show something, like, any questions? And then they look at me like, no. and then they do it for like a minute, and they're like, yeah, coach, could you show me this or that? Or and this is one of the things that I always annoyed the hell out of me when I was a teenager and started my training, was that back then there was very little explanation. It's like, okay, just do it. And I was like, okay, but why? What's the point? What's the purpose? Why do I do it with the left hand, not the right hand, and so on. So I was always the guy asking questions and looking for answers. And now when I teach, I try to do the same thing and explain to my students, okay, so what you're doing right now is not wrong, but that's not what I showed. And if you do it your way, it's going to work, but you won't be able to do what I will show you next, because I'm going to show 3 techniques now. And the first builds, the third builds on the second, and the second builds on the first. And your first is now different from what I want it to be. So it's, and I very often tell them it's rarely like that they do something like completely wrong. It happens, but mostly like what you're doing now is not exactly what I want you to do. And there's a reason why I want you to do that. And some students are really open to that, and others not as much, and they forget, and then next class it's all gone. And others, you see that it really connects, like, okay, so I've got one of my MMA students, he works as a security guard in a hospital, so he doesn't always get to class whenever he wants due to night shifts and so on. And we'd spar, we'd do something, and then next time I see him, he's like, yeah, I've been thinking about that thing you did in sparring, and you caught me with that punch, and he's been thinking about that for 2 weeks, and shadow boxing, practicing counters and so on. Like, okay, that's how you make progress. That's what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. This transcends martial arts, and this is something that I'm always very interested in. What are the universals of human learning and human performance? And the metacognition is a key to achievement, meaning think about what you're doing. Whether you're a biochemist, whether you're an astrophysicist, whether you're a lawyer, think about the whys of what you're doing, and you'll be better at it. And then I also think one of the best things to do, and this is another thing that helps you do that, is teach. If you teach, like I used to be the only kind of, like, I used to be very strict with who could teach in my academy, because I didn't want people to get it wrong, and have like bad technique, and so I used to be like, okay, nobody teaches anybody anything, because you guys are going to just screw it up and it's going to be wrong. And that was originally when I thought. But then I realized that I wanted to empower my students. And I said, okay, if they get it wrong, I have enough leeway where I can correct it and put people on the same class. And also, again, with videos and a lot of repetition of techniques over and over again, that I can correct this. Especially with I try to integrate the videos, like you said, as much as possible, so people can have some sort of visual orientation and syllabus, so they know what it is. But I have my students teach other students, and sometimes I'll have a student, and he just learned the technique yesterday, and I said, okay, I want you to teach what you learned yesterday to this guy today. And when they teach, suddenly something blooms in them, and they start metacogniting. The metacognition level comes there. Oh, this is why I do this. And because they're on the flip side of the teacher, they see what the mistakes that they were making the day before. So just, focus on what your body's doing, make it better, make it more precise, and have a level of body control that is high. But focus on the mental element and the metacognition of the why and the where and the how, and to do that, teach with, of course, with the permission of your instructor, and with the oversight of someone who knows what they're doing, blah, blah. But if you can explain something, it goes that Richard Feynman's a very famous physicist, and I want to try to look it up, but he says there are 3 things of learning. The first one is, like, you kind of understand the concepts, and then, I want to try to find it. But the last one is teach what you want to do to a raw beginner. Explain it. Explain when you really know something is when you can explain, this thing to a person who's a beginner in the art. And so I have all my teach each other, and one makes my job a lot easier. It supercharged the growth of our academy, because suddenly on the mat we have 30 teachers, and of course I'm overseeing everything and making sure everything goes right. But and also the camaraderie goes through the roof. But so thinking about what you do is critical for growth. And like I said, a really great way to do that, if your instructor allows you, acting instructor, is to help the newer students get better. The other thing is, like you said, you hit on the nose. The Socratic method is the most proven way for human beings to learn. And it was, Socrates. It goes all the way back. But I say something, you ask, I respond, and we have this dialogue where we go through, the subject matter, whatever it is. And there's no high-level learning that is absent of the Socratic method, which is why, I went to graduate school at Columbia University, is a famous university here, and, you could see the difference between lecture classes where there's really no learning, and then the real graduate classes where you have a mentor and you sit down, very often in his office or in a small group, and you just go back and forth and discuss. And that's where the learning takes place. Of course, research too. But, you do something, you hypothesize something. The instructor says, oh, what about these points here? Oh, that's a good point. Let me go back. Oh, how about this? He's like, oh, well, that's interesting. How about this? And it's the same thing in martial arts. If you don't develop that Socratic method, your growth will be completely hampered. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why Chinese martial arts, just didn't grow and evolve, because they frown on that method. That method is not part of the Asian teaching methodologies, and that is not part of judo. Judo is an Asian martial art, but Kano Jigoro, the founder of judo, was always Western looking, and the Socratic teaching method is part and parcel of judo, and it is not part of the more traditional martial arts very often, where you kind of can ask and teachers really get pissed off if you ask them questions. It seems like you're disrespecting them, and you can't disagree. And why can't you disagree? Okay, I'm going to lay my facts down here. You lay your facts, and let's go. I had an experience. This is a few weeks ago. It was just before the COVID thing, and I'm kind of making a new move. I won't go too much into details because it's sort of in my bag of new tricks. But I'm making this new move, and I think it's be kind of a little bit revolutionary, because changing the way a certain move is done is very oriented towards MMA. But I started doing this move, and it is really working well for me. And then one of my students, and he's only a blue belt. He's a very good blue belt, but he's only a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's been training with me for a while, though. And he says, I don't think that's going to work like it says. And I said, Danny, what are you talking about? Of course, guys, I just made it work. He's like, no, I think I'm going to do this. Okay, let's spar it out. And guess who was right? He was right. He'd seen a flaw in the technique. And, I would be lying to you if I said I was happy that he did it. I'm like, son of a bitch, man. No, I was laughing at the time. And I'm like, okay, let's do it again. Let's rep it again. And, it was after class, and we probably got 40 reps in. And by the 38th, the 39th, and 40th, I was starting to really stop what he was doing. And it was a great growth moment for me. As a black belt instructor, my blue belt is helping me get better. Because we're having this Socratic method. And he got better too, because he started, adjusting to me. And we had this wonderful learning environment where rank was not an issue. It was not an issue at all. I was the teacher, but really didn't matter. We were just being scientists and working together and striving for the truth. And that's it. To me, that's how you go. And unfortunately, that's not always the environment you have. It's one of the things that I do like about MMA, is because you generally don't wear belts, so you don't really know who's what rank. And so, it's just about what you can do more often. And in my academy, we don't wear any outward, showing of rank. And so it's very much more egalitarian. And there's no you're a white belt, shut the hell up, don't coach me. We don't really have that as much, but it is harder, just because we're human beings, to see that in other contexts. It's not a knock on any other style or anything like that. But I think that Socratic method of learning is the most efficient way to learn. And it also makes your instructor better, makes you better, it makes him a better teacher. But it is definitely frowned upon in a lot of martial arts.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is also a generational thing. like maybe the generation of our teachers, the previous one is that they were brought up differently in when they started learning as young men. Whereas nowadays the world's changed very much, and there's a lot more open. There's a lot more access to information as well, and people nowadays expect that access to be there regardless of what they're training in or studying. So martial arts is not any different. The thing I tell my students, and that's what one of my teachers wrote, and he said, there are no stupid questions, but you know that's kind of a little bit of a cop out. So what he wrote is that a good student looks, listens, thinks, and then asks. And I tell my students that sometimes, like, okay, I think that is the best way, because you can ask questions, but if my next sentence is going to be the answer to that question, because you can wait to ask it, then we're kind of not being very productive here. Or if you just were so busy thinking about your question, you didn't hear me say it, which I've experienced several times with students. It's like, okay, so this is not productive. I just said it a minute ago. Oh, really? So it's.
No, you're completely right. You know, there has to be a skill. You know, I totally know what you're talking about here, because like when students have to learn how to be students, and to some extent we have to teach them how to be students. Not everybody knows how to learn, so, and part of that is listening. And I can tell you, I've had a lot of students with very poor listening skills and also poor coachability skills. So I'll say, move your right hand, and they'll move their left foot. You know, so at some level, you're right. We have to teach them how to learn. And listening is very important. And when you have a student who doesn't know how to listen, not their own fault, but they don't know how to listen, it can be very frustrating. Yeah. It can be very frustrating. But I totally, that is absolutely true. And I said, I don't mind answering questions, but I tell this in my academy, but I hate repeating myself. So they know that I said, I hate repeating myself. So, you know, and don't jump on me. You know, and also that, like I think that sometimes, you know, this, I'll tell you, in the Gracie context, this is, you know, people don't understand why the Gracies were so like, combative against other martial arts styles, and how they kind of had like a bad attitude when they came out. And that's kind of the truth. You know, I have a friend, and he's one of my assistant instructors, and he's a luta libre guy, and he grew up in those wars between styles. And so, you know, when you met a Gracie in 1991 or 92, they kind of had a chip on their shoulder, like, let me prove it. But one of the reasons was because they got no respect. People were like, oh, you know, that you know, on the ground stuff is a bunch of blah blah blah, you know, and they got no respect, so they had to demand that respect. And a lot of times the questions they got were not in good faith. They were like, I'm not really trying to question to learn. I'm trying to question to, you know, prove you up and that you're full of shit. So, you know, they had a kind of combative attitude. And I think it was a little bit true in some martial arts too, that when there's a way to ask a question to learn, and there's a way to ask like we were talking about before, a gotcha question where I just want to make you look stupid. You know, I don't really have gotcha questions, because I think I can you know, like, I can prove my answers right now. I've been doing this for, you know, 45 years now, so it's very hard for you to get me a question about this. But the thing is, are you trying to just question me to see my bona fides, or are you trying to question me to learn? And the minute I understand that you're really not there to learn, you know, then okay, let's call it quits. You know, so the student has to be a true student. He has to listen. He has to act in good faith, and he also has to listen to what you've said and listen to your answer, and really try to understand what you've told him. And I think that's part of the white belt, you know, to black belt journey, is how to learn. You know, and I taught English in as well. And I had some level of instructing, actually basic level Japanese, when I was a grad student helping tutor people. And you'd be surprised how often people don't know how to learn, or they know how to learn from you know, teaching themselves, but they don't know how to learn in an interpersonal context. You know, so learning from a book and learning from a human being are very different. So these are all challenges we have as instructors, and it's part of our larger guiding of our students. Hey, this is the way I want you to do it. So I was like, have to monitor how I do things, and when you have a larger culture of dialogue, most of the time people get it, but it is an issue. Like you bring up a very good point.
All right. Well, I think we got to cover pretty much everything that I wanted to cover.
Well, I think you also want to ask me about like the early days of MMA.
Yeah. Well, we've been going for I think about 90 minutes now, so maybe we can save that for the bonus episode on Patreon.
Sure.
I think
absolutely.
Because otherwise people are going to say like, Wim, another 3-hour podcast. You're not Joe Rogan. Just quickly, where can people reach you? So that's important. I'll put that in the show notes. So that's going to be at wimsblog.com/50. So where can people reach you?
Yeah, so I teach at Radical MMA in New York City, and my website is radicalmmanyc.com. And the best way to reach me is through that website. Radical, RADICAL, MMA, NYC for New York, and .com. And that's the best way to reach me. There's a contact form there. And I'm also active on our Radical MMA Facebook page. And my wife handles our Instagram page. So don't contact me on Instagram because I'm not on it. I'm not a big fan of the Instagram warriors, and so I just stay away from it.
Okay. Renee, I just want a huge thanks to you. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this interview. I'm very happy that we got to cover so much ground and that you got to talk from your experience, which is very extensive. We are going to keep on rolling for the bonus episode for my patrons, but I'm going to say goodbye to everybody and thank you for listening. And check out the bonus episode because it's going to be just as awesome. Okay, take care, everybody. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.